Let's look at skeletal muscle. Remember when I said an organ is not just your stomach, not just your muscle, or not just your brain, but it can also be a muscle, right?
Right.
Skeletal muscle contains, obviously, muscle fibers. But what else might it contain? These muscle cells and these fibers, they got to have certain things and get rid of certain things to operate, like nutrients and waste. What brings that to them?
Like your veins and stuff?
Yeah, blood supply. So there is...
Your veins, your arteries?
There's connective tissue in there. In the veins and the arteries. What about the membranes that surround these fibers and surround your muscles and connect them to bones? They're also connective tissue, right? I'm not spelling that word right at all. Things like this epimysium. What else? How do we signal them to move? If it's voluntary, yeah. Okay, so there's nervous tissue in there. All right, so right there we've just defined an organ because it has more than one type of tissue and cells in it. Okay, if you were to zoom in on a muscle, let's look at this picture here on Chapter 8, 133, Figure 8.1. This is what we're kind of talking about for a minute. Also, you see we got fibers in a muscle, right? They run in different directions. Pop quiz. What do we call fibers that run superior to inferior?
No.
Rectus. Rectus abdominis. That's what causes the six-pack. Okay? So fascia surrounds and separates the muscles. Skeletal muscles, fibers, like other body cells, are soft and fragile, but this connective tissue thing I'm talking about here, this epimysium, this sheath that covers each fiber and each muscle, provides protection, support, and some tensile strength or mechanical stress so those cells just don't fall apart. We do a lot of work with our cells, right? Remember, one of the biggest byproducts of cell work in the muscles is heat. So what does the cell need to make energy, to do work? What's the powerhouse of the cell? Well, you remember this from high school.
Should. Probably should. But I don't right now. ATP.
Okay, ATP is the fuel that these things use, but remember I had mitochondria?
Oh, yeah.
They're the factory that makes that power out of ATP or makes ATP. Well, do you think your muscle cells are going to have a bunch of these or not a bunch of these?
A bunch.
They're going to have a bunch. They're going to do a lot of work, so they'll have a lot of mitochondria in there. All right. So in fact, multiple nuclei are next to this thing called a sarcolemma. And there are numerous mitochondria that provide initial energy for contraction. The cells also contain systematically arranged thread-like organelles called myofilaments that slide across one another during contraction. So if you would go back and look at a muscle fiber from Chapter 5, I think, where we did tissue or just overall anatomy review, it showed these dark bands right here in skeletal muscle. And they're talking about these things right here. If you were to zoom in on that with an electron microscope, we would see these filaments. And these filaments are called actin and myosin. And they kind of look like this a little bit. Okay, I'll write the words up here. Actin and myosin. And you're not going to be tested on this. Your book doesn't get way, I don't think it does get way into this. Well, what happens is when these things are chemically stimulated by the nerve endings that connect to your muscle cell, they will hook onto each other. And that means that this will shrink. So there's, hundreds of thousands of these filaments in these little dark bands, and then this is one muscle cell. You get that multiplied times one fiber, and then a bunch of fibers in a bundle, which creates a muscle. You get this magnifying effect that causes you to be able to lift and do work with your muscles. But it all starts with actin and myosin. It's really neat how those work. As a matter of fact, it's not a picture. I had a textbook with a picture on the front. They look like a little thing walking. I'll have to find a YouTube video and post it. Okay, so we got mitochondria. There's a lot of them in these cells because they do a lot of work. They need a lot of energy to run. Actin and myosin, these little fibers that contract, that are working on a molecular basis to make our cells work. Just a little bit of review there. All right. And then the last thing I want to make sure I know are this membrane in a muscle cell is called a sarcolemma. I think it's 2 M's. Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Okay. And the contents. Okay. Instead of a cytoplasm, which is just the gel inside of a cell, it's called the sarcoplasm. But this membrane has something special. That's what we're getting ready to go look at here. Just a second. So some key terms here: sarcolemma, sarcoplasm, epimysium. And we're still talking about how these cells actually work. Under nerve and blood supply on page 132, it says, skeletal muscles have an abundant supply of blood vessels and nerves. This directly is related to the primary function of contraction. Before a skeletal muscle fiber can contract, it must receive an impulse from a nerve cell. Muscle contraction requires adenosine triphosphate. Here's another term. ATP. Adenosine triphosphate. It just means it has 3 phosphate atoms on it. And this configuration of this molecule, okay, your adenosine ring is going to be like down in here. This is a high energy molecule right here. And when you peel one of these phosphate ions off or atoms off, there's a huge release of energy. And your cells harness that energy to do work. That's why ATP is fuel. At this point, it's actually called adenosine diphosphate. Okay? But we need to get it back up to here so we can harness this energy once this phosphate's peeled off, right? Through different metabolic pathways. So how do we do, what supplies that? Well, if you look over here and skip to energy sources and oxygen debt for a second, on page 133 it says the immediate or initial source of energy is ATP, and surprisingly your muscles only have a little bit of this ATP molecule in it. In working muscles, the stored ATP is depleted in about 6 seconds, and new ATP must be regenerated if its muscle contraction is to continue. Okay, so creatine phosphate is a unique high-energy compound that is stored in muscles, and that compound provides almost instantaneous regeneration of ATP. Notice it has that phosphate on it, right? And we need, when this is converted to ADP, its lower energy form, we got to add another phosphate to it, so that's where it comes from. And we have lots of that on reserve. Skipping down here, when muscles are actively contracting for extended periods of time, fatty acids and glucose become primary energy sources. Okay? As ATP and creatine phosphate stores are being used, more ATP is produced from the metabolism of glucose and fatty acids. So we can get ATP from multiple sources. We've got some stored. We can take glucose and sorry, I lost my train of thought here. Fatty acids, which are also sources to make ATP. Okay, if you remember from high school.
Do you know how long ago high school was?
Yeah, if you don't remember like the basic stuff, did they teach you anything?
In my high school? Somewhat.
So, for one glucose molecule, everybody understands glucose, right? It's the basic sugar that we eat in our food that allows us to make energy. From one glucose molecule, you get 30 ATP, according to this first one I found right here, through these giant metabolic pathways called glycolysis, which is the breaking down of glucose, through conversion of pyruvate to acetyl-CoA, and then in plants it turns into making starches and sugar, making glucose. We're breaking it down. We don't make glucose in our body, we make glycogen. But it's just the opposite for plants. Okay, so I'm just trying to, and then fatty acids, they yield some too, but then it's not as efficient as glucose. So we can break these down, make ATP, or we can use creatine phosphate and also make it. All right, the point is to get to this, where this phosphate can be peeled off, and then we've got energy released to do work on. All right, the way this works, a quick example, just to show you how cool biochemistry is. If you were to look at the membrane of a mitochondria, it's unique because mitochondria has a double membrane inside. Meaning it's got a membrane inside and a membrane outside, and it has this space right here. Okay? Not too many organelles have two membranes. So they think this is like an old organelle that was one of the first precursors to the cells we see today in evolutionary theory. It also has its own DNA, right?
Yeah.
If you were to zoom in right here, okay, I would have a bunch of proteins that would be a chain where electrons can jump through once they peeled off that phosphate. And at the end, there would be this really cool protein that looks like a turbine. Okay, and it spins. Well, what causes it to spin? Well, we're mostly made of water, right? This is just a little bit of FYI stuff for a second. We're mostly made of water, and if you see right here, water molecules have 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen in it, and we get to break that apart through cellular respiration. Okay? So what we end up with is a huge abundance of hydrogen ions, or we just call them, sometimes we just call them protons for short. Okay? And because of those things we learned about in chapter 5 and 6, like concentration gradients and diffusion, where's concentration gradients here? Right. So these end up pouring through this little turbine protein, and as they pour through, they cause it to spin, literally like an engine. And this is where ADP will come. It will get linked up and come out as an ATP for more work. Okay, and if you look here at the middle of page 133 on the right, it says if adequate oxygen is available, fatty acids and glucose are broken down in the mitochondria by a process called aerobic respiration. The products are carbon dioxide, water, and a large amount of ATP. And so this is why oxygen is so important to us. When we breathe in oxygen, we breathe in this type of oxygen. When it peels off, it has an extra electron, and it is happy to accept these. And then we get to use water as a waste to get rid of these extra electrons or these protons that we don't need right now. So sometimes we run out of oxygen in our cells, in our muscle cells, because of too much work. What are we going to do about this? This don't work. Aerobic, okay? So I just gave you a quick example, which you don't have to recall any of it, of what aerobic respiration means. That's another important term here. Aerobic respiration, okay, is O2 is required. You have an aerobic organism. That organism needs an oxygen environment to live. We're an aerobic organism. Some bacteria are aerobic, and then some are anaerobic. Some, it's toxic to be in an oxygen environment. But we also do respiration in the absence of oxygen, and that's called anaerobic. That A in there meaning without. So it's got like a backup. When this first one runs out of ATP quickly, we switch over to glucose. Well, that is anaerobic respiration. Okay, and a product of that reaction, which is super cool when you go learn about pyruvate and acetyl-CoA and all these different things, is lactic acid. Okay, so 1, 2, 3 important terms right here. Make sure you understand that lactic acid is produced during anaerobic respiration after supplies have been depleted, and we're doing long distance running, or we're doing a lot of work that's going to last more than just a short burst. Okay, we've got enough good fuel that's sufficient to like get out of the way of a car or run from a line for a second or two. But then we're on here, we're endurance. And so lactic acid, if you've ever done something to where your arm has started to burn, like you're carrying a big bag of groceries and your forearm is burning, you know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
Or you're carrying a kid and your arm is just on fire, that burning sensation is lactic acid being built up in your muscles because you picked the kid up, you initially ran out of ATP in 6 seconds or so.
Right.
And so now this is being produced, and the more lactic acid, the more burning, until eventually there's muscle failure. There's so much of this built up that ATP and that contraction can't work. You get muscle failure, but it recovers quickly, right? Lactic acid will eventually be moved to your liver where it's converted back into glucose via oxygen. So it's recycled, okay? Too much lactic acid in your muscles for long periods of time can be debilitating. It's chronic diseases that we can test for. Some people have with lactic acid. But just a couple different terms there I want you to know about and how muscle contracts. It says here at the bottom, anaerobic pathway provides ATP about 2.5 times faster than aerobic. Just reading on, finishing this up, it says periods of strenuous exercise on back of 134, top left, that require anaerobic mechanisms to regenerate ATP create an oxygen debt that must be repaid before equilibrium can be restored. Okay, we're talking about equilibrium of back to the normal levels of this, and then this level requiring. This is during anaerobic respiration when things are getting out of whack, you're reaching your maximum point of work, and at that point you have to stop and rest, and it will reset. That oxygen has to be paid back. There's an accumulation of lactic acid in the muscle that may cause temporary muscle pain and cramping. The ATP and creatinine phosphate in the muscle are depleted and need to be replenished. So you sit there and you have to take in additional oxygen. What do you? You're repaying your oxygen debt. Okay. That's converting lactic acid back into glycogen, a process that occurs in the liver. Glycogen is the storage form of glucose. Oxygen is also necessary. Actually, I'm sorry, glycogen. Yeah, that's right. Glycogen is it glucose, glycogen, and glucagon? Glycogen is a stored form of glucose. It is. I'm sorry. This additional oxygen is necessary to convert lactic acid into glycogen, a process that occurs in the liver. Oxygen is also necessary to replenish the ATP and creatinine phosphate in the muscle. Oxygen debt is defined as the additional oxygen that is required after physical activity to restore resting conditions. All right. So if you can just get these two things in your head, that this is what this is the norm, but it didn't last very long. It's only meant for us to like get out of the way of something dangerous. And this is what we kick into during extended periods because supplies of ATP and creatinine phosphate are short. Then we go into burning fatty acids and glucose, which produces this, causes muscle pain, and then eventually we'll reach a point of maximum saturation where it has to go back to equilibrium. And you'll be okay with these two terms here. I'm going to come back and talk about why this sarcolemma is special, this cell membrane here, and then we'll have most of this out of the way. Any questions about that?
I got it. But we'll see.
All right. Let me redraw this for a second. All right, well, we're going to learn in the next chapter what a nerve cell looks like. And a nerve cell has a cell body. You don't have to write this down yet. This long end, and it's got these little fingers or tendrils on the other side. Do you remember what these are called?
Little axon branches thingy-majigers.
Right, this is the axon. This is the cell body. And these are called dendrites. And they're made so information can go into the cell, it's processed, and it's sent down the line to either your brain or to an effector to where you'll get a movement or an action will happen. A hormone might release, or a gland might release a hormone. A muscle might contract. You know, whatever.
Something's gonna happen.
Something's going to happen. So information is generally traveling this way in this scenario we're talking about. All right? And if you were to zoom in on your muscle cell, okay, there would be a little depression in that membrane, and this would actually end in like a bulb. And they don't touch. There's a space in between. So I'm going to draw this picture a little bit bigger over here. All right. Okay, so this is my axon, and this is my sarcolemma, right? So we're talking about a neuromuscular junction here. And that is where your nerves and your muscles connect. Your book will go on to state, and I would encourage you to go back and review this, that there's a bundle, one nerve ending, one axon, can activate bundles of fibers that's as little as 10 fibers, or it can be as many as 100,000, whatever it takes, okay? But what that results in is you being able to control certain fibers in the muscles to produce either fine or general huge movements. Well, how does this work? They don't touch. How does this nerve communicate with this muscle fiber or this bundle?
There's a transmitter somewhere in there.
Well, that's right. It will send something called a neurotransmitter, which is a chemical, across this gap here, which is called the synaptic cleft. It's just a giant chasm. It's just a valley. Okay. And when that signal travels down this nerve and ends up in this bulb here, it will signal to release a neurotransmitter, which we have many types of. Okay. They will come across and they will join up with this, and that muscle cell knows, okay, I've got the key, now I can move. One neurotransmitter that this book mentions in this chapter is what? Read it there for me. It's a big, long, cool word. Page 133.
That acetylcholine or something?
Acetylcholine.
Acetylcholine.
Okay, and it's abbreviated as ACH. All right. Other neurotransmitters you might be familiar with are dopamine, serotonin, melatonin, just many more.
Well, everybody's giving their kids to make them go to bed. That's
Right.
ridiculous.
So we're talking about skeletal muscle, right? This is important for you moving. This acetylcholine. think of things that might affect the uptake of this cell and this neurotransmitter. VX gas, a biological agent that's used in warfare, it comes in and it basically docks with these receptors and says no neurotransmitter, and so this stays in the synaptic cleft. You end up convulsing, foaming at the mouth, and dying, in no time. Others.
It's horrible but cool at the same time.
Yeah. So others, say a muscle relaxer, like Valium, a skeletal muscle relaxant is what it's called specifically. You should see that in your drug cards. Okay. It's going to partially block some of this uptake, which is going to have an effect of less contractions on your muscles. So you're not all the time being signaled, maybe because who knows what's going on.
It's going to calm your bit down.
Or say that muscle just needs to be quiet while it's healing. You can give skeletal muscle relaxants like Soma and Valium that will just partially block this and cause a general relaxation.
So basically, if they're giving you a medicine to put you in a chemical, it is kind of that's what they're doing.
It works right here.
It blocks
Most skeletal muscle relaxants work right there. There's others that work in different places in different ways, but
most of them work that.
I'm not familiar with them.
So,
Okay, so for every chemical you have in your body, you most likely have an enzyme that breaks that chemical down because things are at equilibrium all the time, right?
right.
Oxygen, carbon dioxide, sodium, potassium type stuff. Well, the one that takes up this acetylcholine, once it's done its job here and this muscle needs to relax, something's got to come in and release it. So it can be took back up and reused again for the next lightning fast signal. This all happens in blink of an eye. Well, that one is called acetylcholine esterase. It's right here on page 133. See, I can spell the hard words. And that's an enzyme, and we know it's an enzyme because it ends with that little suffix called ase. All right, anytime you see something that ends in that ase right there, you can pretty much always bet that it's an enzyme. It's going to be breaking something down. Okay. It's pretty cool. So I've got things like this sarcolemma. You know why it's important to know that word. Synaptic cleft, what an axon is, what a neurotransmitter is, and the specific neurotransmitter we've talked about, which is acetylcholine. What are you thinking of right now? What are you thinking about right now?
That just stuff comes back to me as I read it.
Mm-hmm.
Or for some reason, it just doesn't come to me when I want to think it.
Oh, when I was talking about how one of these can connect to either a few fibers or a bunch of fibers, whatever it does connect to, that whole thing, whether it's 10 or 100, it's called a motor unit. That's in bold right here on 132. I meant to put that up there. Yeah. Okay, so on your chapter 7 and 8 exam on Friday, I'm going to ask you explain to me in a couple sentences what's happening with a skeletal muscle relaxant, or why do you have something like rigor mortis? What's going on with rigor mortis? You know?
Yeah, you're dead. Your body's tightening up because there's no more muscle.
Right, if cells are dead, right?
Right, everything's dead.
Is any of this being produced?
No, you have like that thing going on.
Is any of this being produced?
Nope.
Right, so muscles stay locked up.
Right. But rigor mortis only lasts for so long, don't it?
Right.
Eventually goes away.
Eventually the physical properties of this cell will begin to melt away and you will relax.
And that's why they take the temperature of your liver.
Yeah. Let me read about tetanus real quick. I don't know why it causes lockjaw. The word tetanus is often confusing because it means different things to different people. In reference to muscle contraction, tetany denotes a steady contraction of muscle fiber without a relaxation phase. The word also refers to a disease commonly called lockjaw. That is caused by a bacterium. The toxin bacteria causes nerves to be highly excitable, which in turn causes uncontrollable muscle contractions or spasms. So that toxin comes in here and works on your nerves and floods this with ACH enough to where this one cannot keep up, and so you get spasms. Calcium is also important here. The lack of calcium increases nerve excitability, which resulting spasms, yada yada yada. Okay, and then I might also ask you one more question. Hint, hint, hint. Why? Actually, I'll just leave that one. That's okay. I'm not going to spring nothing on you. Any questions about that? I think I covered the majority of everything I wanted to say. I will now ask you about fasciculus.
Did you say you won't?
I won't. But sarcolemma and sarcoplasm are free game.
Is that your notes that you was looking for the other day and you couldn't find it, or is that the same
Yeah.
ones?
Okay. And then right here, I wanted to also tell you what aponeurosis is. I gave you that face worksheet. Oh, I printed it. Didn't bring it. Let me go grab that real quick. Sorry. There you go. This is it. I did have this available for you on Monday, but I got it now. And then I also put this on the internet for you, Contessa. This broad sheet, it's a big anchor for the muscle. It's called aponeurosis. You can see it in places like your abdomen and a few things when you're looking through the muscles here. Aponeurosis, for example. Okay. And then the last cool thing I wanted to tell you, I meant to tell you on Monday, was you've got right here. Read that to me. There you go.
The most intact skeletal muscles are attached to the bones by tendons that span joints. When the muscle contracts one bone, the insertion moves rotationally the other bone, the origin. Frequently, muscles work in groups to perform particular movements. If one muscle has a primary role in providing a movement, it is called a prime mover. Muscles that work with or assist the prime mover to cause movement that are called synergists. Often muscles span more than one joint, and a synergist will stabilize one joint while the prime mover acts on the other joints. For example, the fingers can be flexed to make a fist without bending the wrist, because certain muscles fix the wrist in a stabilized position.
Okay.
Antagonists are muscles that oppose or reverse particular movements.
So give an example of that one.
The bicep brachial muscle in the anterior arm flexes the forearm at the elbow. The triceps muscle on the posterior arm extends the forearm at the elbow. The two muscles are the opposite sides of the humerus and have opposite functions. They are antagonized.
Yeah, bones and muscles work together to perform different types of movements. And just FYI, every muscle movement you make is the effect of one other muscle doing a pulling motion. So if I want to flex my arm, my fingers, it's a terrible drawing, I know. If I want to flex my arm this way, right, this muscle has to pull, right? It has to pull this limb up. And if I want to extend it, then this muscle has to pull. It's literally pulling this bone down, right?
Right.
That's every muscle movement in your body. So even when you push something, even when you're pushing,
So every muscle has a push and a pull.
no, only pull.
Pull.
If I'm pushing this board, I'm applying force with my arm, okay? Well, it's this muscle that's flexed. It's doing this to move my arm forward to apply that pressure. So even when I'm pushing, my muscle is still pulling. And that's simple physics. Pulling is easier to do than pushing, overcoming efficiency and coefficient of drag and stuff like that. Your body, your muscles only pull to produce any movement you've got. I'm going to lift my leg, something is pulling. I'm going to curl my fist, it's muscles pulling. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yes.
So even when I'm pushing,
Everything's pull.
muscles are only pulling on levers like bones to do the movement because pulling is more efficient than pushing. So you were designed in a way that helps you to move efficiently. And even when you're doing push-ups, you're really just pulling on levers in your arms to make yourself do that. All right. Any questions?